My name is Peter Ward, and I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Sociology and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Today I'm going to be talking about making room for housing, rehab, and densification in consolidated informal settlements. As we begin to move toward Habitat 3 in 2016, I think it's likely that we're going to be looking much more at holistically at urban development and housing within that rather than housing per se. And as we begin to shift away from some of the major housing projects that are commonplace today in Latin America, we're going to be moving back to the city focus, moving away from these massive social interest housing projects which require new infrastructure, they have poor transportation linkages, dislocation, weak sense of community, and so forth. These areas are already seeing high levels of abandonment and high vacancy rates. So we're going to be moving back to look at the existing housing stock in cities, which already have the infrastructure services, they have good public transportation, albeit sometimes inadequate and heavily deteriorated networks. My focus today is going to be looking at a new generation of housing policies. In those parts of the city that are primarily low income and which began some 20 or 30 years ago in what was then the urban periphery. Often those areas, of course, are self-built. They now form part of the intermediate ring of these cities, the inner suburbs, or what I call the inner burbs, the first suburbs of these cities. There's been heavy densification in those areas. But what we're looking at today is essentially the need for renovation and new housing policies through urban regeneration, and especially through housing rehabilitation and community rehabilitation. In short, how can we make room for the future uses within the existing urban infrastructure and housing stock, both for current and for future generations? And how to achieve this without private sector and neoliberal interventions that will lead or might lead to displacement of the existing residential populations and facilitate gentrification. So what is the context of this back to the city focus that I'm talking about? We're focusing upon the first suburbs, or what I'm calling the inner burbs. In this image you can see the city of Monterey, and you can see the intermediate ring in green beyond the city center and the inner urban area. The area in green developed in the 1960s and 1970s, and you can see the suburban development beyond that. Most of these green areas are low-income, self-built settlements, and we're talking about a significant proportion of the population. Something like 25 to 50% of metropolitan areas, at least in Latin America, comprise these first suburbs, these inner burbs. And we're talking about 1 million population in Monterey of 4 million total. Mexico City, it's 11.5 million of just over 20 million in terms of total. Quite high densities already too. We're talking about 90 to 120 persons per hectare overall, and with double that in terms of the densities of the actual settlements, of course. The following points that I'm going to raise, and the images that you'll be seeing on the screen, come from the Latin American Housing Network, or LAHN. This is a collaborative network of researchers working across 9 countries in 11 metropolitan areas in Latin America. And much of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from that Latin American survey, but I think the points I'm raising about rehabilitation have much wider applications. We're essentially working to a common framework and strategy to analyze these inner burbs using census data, geographical information systems, intensive detailed household surveys, and all of this information, indeed the databases, are on the LAHN website for you to be able to consult if you wish. The aim of the LAHN has been to understand better the contemporary family and household dynamics associated with these areas, particularly given that the families have had an extensive history of self-building over time. And in part, it's looking at that self-building process tied to the family building and household dynamic over the 20-year period. Given that these are incrementally built through self-build, they've had intensive use over 20 to 30 years, these neighborhoods themselves are often highly deteriorated, as is the housing, in need of repair, retrofitting of pipes and electrical wiring, new staircases to access second and third floors and so forth. And how can we, as researchers and planners and practitioners of non-government organizations, how should we be working toward policies and supports that will improve the habitability of the dwelling environment on the one hand, and recast or reorganize the space in these dwellings and lots in order to cater for the new and future household needs? So, thinking about self-build consolidation, the dwelling build-out process and so forth, as you can see in in the slides, you can see planned development from the early occupation of the lot through the building of the lot, second and third stories, the reorganization of space. You can see also here the three-dimensional rendering of that process. Basically, what we're talking here about a build-out over a long period of time, as I say, 20 or 30 years. We're often, these lots are, and the dwellings themselves are shared, usually with close kin, adult children and their families. We're beginning to see these housing environments meeting the needs of second and third generation households, most of whom were born in the settlement itself. These are residents, these are native born and often community born adults today. See high levels of mobility of those adult siblings and grandkids leaving the family home, the parental home, the grandparental home, often coming back at a later stage. There's this rotation, if you like, that we see and we're beginning to understand in much more detail. We're talking about higher densities, increasing densities as the family expands, as the family extends itself, as other kinsmen join the house temporarily, as renters and others occupy space within the dwelling unit. The nature of these inner burbs in terms of population and physical perspectives, population perspectives first. Interestingly, the Latin American housing network data show that a minimal mobility of owners. This really is a home is forever for these low-income populations. 80% of the families that we interviewed were the original families who occupied the lot. They've now been living 20, 30, 35, 40 years in the same lot. There's been a lot of in and out movement, as I've just mentioned, but the owners have remained living on the lot, and it's now providing the family home not only for the owners, the original owners, but also for second and indeed third generation members. Second point is that the aging of these original owners, they acquired the lot when they're in the 20s, early 20s, mid-20s. Today they're over 60, many are over 70. What that means is that they're beginning to pass away and pass on their properties to their children, either through the process of intestacy, whereby the property is divided among the children, or through informal arrangements. This is creating title impediments in those locations where there have been programs of title regularization. Then this is going to cause title impediments arising from succession. We see high aspirations of second and third generations and emerging conflicts between those over the inheritance process. Physical problems in the inner burbs, you can see in these slides here, the high level of physical dilapidation after 30 years of intensive use. Although these areas are fully serviced, the public spaces and utilities and infrastructure often needs rehabilitation and replacement. The dwellings themselves, of course, are, as you can see here, a highly deteriorated fabric. There's a need for rewiring, for new pipes, for new bathrooms, bathroom replacement, and so forth. Population densities are high and are increasing. There's widespread renting and infill in these areas. Lots have multiple occupancies. More than one household is fairly common. Adult children often, these people, and second and generation usage and so forth. Lot densities are increasing overall. High levels of overcrowding. Certainly, often in the second and third dwelling unit on the lot are the highest levels of overcrowding. High asset values. Surprisingly, these properties today have considerable value. We're talking about, in the case of Monterey, that we've mentioned already, something like $25,000, the average, the median property value. Bogota, Colombia, $30,000 to $40,000. In Santiago, Chile, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and Guadalajara, Mexico, we're talking about $40,000 to $50,000, and goes up to about $100,000 in the case of Mexico City. So these are high asset values for these properties. Public spaces are also intensively used. You can see here in these slides how parking on the street, but also up onto the sidewalk. When these areas developed 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, no one expected to have a vehicle. Now many people do. You can see also the shops and extensions to those shops, cafes out onto the street, workshop extensions also, storage of materials on the street, even playing on the street. You can see the basketball court here from the street. Sometimes too also it's necessary to retrofit a staircase from the sidewalk up to the second and third floors. So you're seeing here an invasion almost of the public space in these cases. So what does all this mean for a new generation of policy making and UN Habitat 3? My concluding propositions. First of all, we need to get the policymakers' attention. Despite this quickening of interest in a back-to-the-city approach, the low-income first suburbs or inner burbs are rarely on the policymakers' radar screens, except for hotspots of insecurity, drugs, drug gangs, and so forth. We need to engage their attention, therefore, as a part of this back to the city and sustainable city conversation, and to emphasize the need to make smarter use of existing urban infrastructure and housing stock, but avoiding past experiences of displacement of poor household communities. Second, rehab is likely to be an important part of future housing policies. Communities, planners, practitioners, we should all think creatively about housing and urban rehabilitation, including the ways in which house building may incorporate green and sustainable materials and practices, improving the habitat and the habitability of neighborhoods. And this should take place at three levels. First of all, the macro level, the community, improving and renovating plazas, streets, education, market activities, and so forth, retrofitting for higher densities. The often forgotten meso level, the level between the house and the street. This is a public space that, as we've already seen, is sometimes being invaded, but it's also a semi-private space, or it's seen to be so by the community themselves. And then the micro or dwelling level, the housing rehab and retrofits, the reorganization of and subdivision of space. This has been the main feature of the LAHN focus to date. We need to make the property market work more effectively for those existing low-income owners. Although, as we've seen, these have high asset values or relatively higher asset values, the lack of formal financing to support buyouts makes low-income housing market dysfunctional, since few owners find that they can sell at the market rate, even if they wanted to do so. So we need to improve the capacity to be able to leverage the asset value where people wish to sell. We need to improve opportunities for physical and socioeconomic mobility. We need to enhance investment in remodeling and housing rehabilitation. And we need to improve the sustainability of property tax revenues where these exist in the cities. We need to encourage formal and informal renting. And fourth, we need to take a cross-generational view. We need to think, plan, and build a cross-generation, beyond that of the original self-builders to their second and third generation children and grandchildren, recognizing that for many of these residents, housing in the inner burbs has an ongoing use value and is often the only opportunity for access to home ownership for those second and third generations. Given the ongoing use value for some of these beneficiaries, we need to think about traditional practices of property inheritance, and these will rarely work. So we need to create a mediation and financial services to assist with the transfer of property ownership shares, whether these are legal titles or use rights of ownership. For further information about this new generation of housing policies for consolidated settlements, may I invite you to go to the Latin American Housing Network website. The address is on the screen. Thank you.